He was just supposed to fix her outlet, a quick job in a quiet apartment. But when Lila's gaze lingered too long, I felt the air shift, like we were breaking some unspoken rule. What she did next would haunt me for years. The air in Port Haven was thick with the briny tang of the sea, laced with a faint metallic bite from the rusted hulls of fishing boats moored along the docks. I'd been back in town for less than a week, holed up in my uncle's old house on Sable Street, a sagging two-story relic with chipped green paint and a front porch that creaked like it was begging to be put out of its misery. At 23, I was a college graduate with a literature degree that felt as useless as the stacks of faded nautical charts cluttering the attic. No job, no clear path, just a vague plan to sort through my uncle's junk and maybe sell the place before summer bled into fall. Port Haven wasn't home anymore, but it was where I'd landed, like a fish washed up after a storm, still flopping, still figuring out how to breathe. That morning, I was wrestling with a cardboard box stuffed with my uncle's moldy paperbacks, hauling it toward the used bookstore on Coral Avenue. The sun was already high, baking the cracked asphalt, and sweat beaded on my neck as I trudged past the bait shops and weathered storefronts. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jarring me out of my haze. It was Jonas Hartley, a guy I'd known since high school, though we'd never been tight. Jonas was all wiry energy and loud laughs, the kind of electrician who could fix a circuit and charm a room without breaking a sweat. His text was short. "Yo, Nate, you free? Need an extra hand for a quick job? $50? Easy." I had no plans, no money, and no good reason to say no. I typed back, "Where?" and he sent an address. Bayside Lofts, a brick apartment complex tucked behind the Greasy Spoon Diner on Anchor Way. I got there in 20 minutes, my sneakers scuffing the gravel in the parking lot. The building was old, its red brick faded to a dull pink, with narrow windows that glinted like they were hoarding the morning light. Jonas was leaning against his beat-up van, toolbox at his feet, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Nate Calder, my hero," he said, grinning as he flicked the cigarette away and tossed me a pair of work gloves. They were stiff, too big, reeking of motor oil and copper wire. "You ever mess with electrical stuff?" "Not a chance," I said, tugging the gloves on. "But I can hold things." "That'll do," he said, leading me up a staircase that groaned under our weight. The job was straightforward. Flickering lights in apartment 3B, probably a loose wire in the ceiling fixture. Jonas Cleveland would handle the real work. I was just there to pass tools and keep the wires steady. We reached the door and Jonas knocked, his knuckles rapping sharply against the wood. The door opened almost instantly, and there she was. Lila Warwick. I didn't know her name yet, but her presence hit me like a rogue wave. She was tall, with dark hair swept back in a loose bun, a few strands curling against her cheek. Her eyes were hazel, sharp and deep, carrying a weariness that made her look like she'd seen too many late nights and not enough good ones. She wore a gray sweater that hung softly on her frame and jeans that fit like they'd been tailored for her. I pegged her for late 30s, maybe early 40s, though there was a quiet elegance to her that made age feel irrelevant. She looked at Jonas first, then me, and her gaze lingered, just a heartbeat longer than it should have, like she was trying to place me in some story she hadn't read yet. "Morning, Ms. Warwick," Jonas said, all business, stepping past her with his toolbox. "This is Nate, helping me out today. We'll get those lights sorted." She nodded, stepping aside to let us in. "Thank you for coming so fast," she said, her voice low, with a slight rasp, like she'd been silent too long and the words were rusty. "It's been flickering for days. Keeps me awake." Her apartment was small, meticulously tidy, with hardwood floors that gleamed under the morning light. The air carried a faint lavender scent, soft and clean, like it was part of the walls. A bookshelf stood against one wall, crammed with dog-eared paperbacks and a few framed photos I tried not to stare at. The living room flowed into a kitchenette, where a single coffee mug sat on the counter, steam rising from it like a ghost. I noticed her hands as she pointed to the ceiling light, long fingers, no rings, nails clipped short but neat. She moved with a kind of deliberate grace, like every gesture was measured, holding something back. Jonas set up his ladder, rattling off small talk about the weather and the diner's new burger special. I stood there, feeling like a kid in a grown-up's house, my hands shoved in my pockets until he snapped me out of it. Nate grabbed the flathead screwdriver from the box. I rummaged through his tools, hyper-aware of Lila watching from the kitchen, her arms crossed loosely, her eyes flickering between us and the ceiling. The fixture was a tangle of old wires, and Jonas swore softly as he wrestled with them. "Hold these," he said, handing me a bundle of wires, their insulation cracked and brittle. "Don't let 'em move." I stood there, arms up, the wires heavy in my grip, her gaze heavier still. She wasn't staring, not exactly, but every time I glanced her way, her eyes met mine, then darted off, like she'd been caught. It wasn't flirtation, nothing so blatant. It was like she was sizing me up, trying to figure out what I was doing in her world. I wondered the same about her. No kids, no husband, just that lone mug and a quiet that felt too big for this small space. "You from here?" she asked suddenly, her voice slicing through Jonas's muttering. I looked at her, caught off guard. "Yeah, sort of. Grew up in Port Haven, left for college, just got back a few days ago." She nodded, her lips pressing together like she was chewing on my answer. "This town's got a way of pulling you back," she said. "Doesn't let go easy." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, the wires twitching in my hands. Jonas chuckled from the ladder. "Nate's just passing through, right? Got big city plans." "Maybe," I said, though I didn't. I had no plans, just an ache to be anywhere but here, and her eyes seemed to see that, cutting through me like she knew the weight I carried. She turned away, sipping her coffee, the steam curling around her face. The job stretched longer than expected. A wire was frayed deep in the fixture, forcing Jonas to replace half the setup. I stood there, passing screws, holding tools, trying not to notice Lila's quiet orbit around the apartment, refilling her mug, adjusting a book on the shelf, her movements precise but restless. She brought us water at one point, setting 2 glasses on the coffee table without a word. Her fingers brushed mine as she handed me one, and I felt a spark, not from the wires but from her, sharp and unnameable. She didn't react, or if she did, it was buried under that calm exterior. When we finished, the light glowed steady, no flicker. Jonas packed up, already talking about his next job, but I was watching Lila by the window, her silhouette framed against the harbor's gray haze. Her shoulders slumped slightly like she was carrying something heavier than she let on. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but the words felt wrong, like they'd break something fragile. "Thanks again," she said as we reached the door, her voice softer now, carrying a weight I couldn't place. Jonas waved it off, already halfway down the hall, but I lingered, my hand on the doorknob. "No trouble," I said, meeting her eyes. "If it acts up again, call Jonas." She nodded, that look in her eyes again, like she saw something in me I hadn't found yet. "I will," she said, and the door closed, leaving me with the echo of her voice. Outside, Jonas slapped my back, handing me a crumpled 50. "Easy money, huh?" he said, climbing into his van. I nodded, but my mind was still upstairs, caught in the lavender air and the weight of her gaze. I walked back to Sable Street, the town quiet around me, but inside, something was stirring, something I didn't understand yet. This was only the beginning. You don't know what she'll decide to do in a few hours. The days after that first job at Bayside Lofts blurred into a restless haze, each one sinking into the next like the tide dragging sand from the shore. Port Haven hadn't changed. Same briny air, same weathered awnings flapping along Mariner's Row. But I felt different, like I'd stepped into a room I wasn't supposed to be in. I was 23, supposed to be piecing together a life, but instead I was sifting through my uncle's old house on Sable Street, boxing up fishing rods and faded maps while my mind kept drifting back to Lila Warwick. Her hazel eyes, sharp and heavy, lingered in my head like a line from a book I couldn't put down. I told myself it was nothing, just a moment, a glance, but the weight of it stuck, like salt on my skin. I spent my mornings in the house, sorting through dusty shelves and rusted tools, the creak of the floorboards keeping me company. Afternoons I'd wander, grabbing coffee at the Dory Cafe or staring at job listings on my phone, none of them sparking anything real. I kept finding excuses to walk past Anchorway, my eyes flicking to the brick facade of Bayside Lofts, half hoping I'd see her in the parking lot, half hoping I wouldn't. I didn't know what I'd say if I did. Hey, remember me? The guy who held your wires? It sounded pathetic, even in my head. It was late Tuesday when Jonas texted again, his message popping up while I was eating a cold sandwich in the kitchen. Another job at Bayside Lofts, light switch acting funky. You in? Same deal, $50. My pulse jumped, and I hated how much I wanted it to be her apartment. I told myself it probably wasn't, just another unit, another tenant. But I replied, yeah, I'm free, and was out the door in 10 minutes, the afternoon sun glinting off the harbor like a warning. Jonas was late, stuck at a job across town, so I waited in the parking lot, leaning against his van, the gravel crunching under my sneakers. The air was warm, thick with the smell of fried onions from the diner across the street. I scrolled through my phone, skimming job ads I'd never apply for when I heard footsteps. I looked up, and there she was, Lila, crossing the lot with a canvas grocery bag slung over her shoulder. Her dark hair was loose today, catching the breeze, and she wore a navy jacket over a white shirt, simple but striking. She didn't see me at first, her eyes on the ground, her steps measured like she was carrying more than just groceries. When she looked up, she froze, just for a second, then kept walking. Nate, she said, stopping a few feet away, her voice low and familiar, like we'd been talking all day. Back again? Yeah, I said, pocketing my phone, trying to sound casual. Jonas roped me into another job, light switch this time. She nodded, shifting the bag. A loaf of sourdough peeked out, next to a bottle of red wine, its label catching the light. He's always late, she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You look like you're melting out here. Want to wait inside? I should have said no. I didn't know her, not really, and there was no reason to follow her into her apartment. But the sun was relentless, and her offer wasn't just polite. It was deliberate, like she wanted me there. Sure, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Thanks. Her apartment was the same. Tidy, quiet, the lavender scent softer today, like it was fading into the walls. She set the bag on the kitchen counter and started unpacking. Apples, a pint of cream, the wine, her movements precise but unhurried. I stood near the door, hands in my pockets, feeling like I'd wandered into someone else's life. The bookshelf caught my eye again, the photos still there. A younger Lila, smiling with a man whose face I couldn't quite make out. I looked away before she noticed. Nice place, I said, because silence felt too loud. Feels lived in. It's home, she said, not turning around, her hands busy with the groceries. For now. There was a heaviness in her voice, like she was talking about more than the apartment. I guessed she was around 40, maybe a little older, her poise carrying a weight that made her seem both timeless and worn. I shifted, my sneakers scuffing the hardwood. You read a lot? I asked, nodding at the bookshelf, trying to fill the space between us. When I get the chance, she said, finally facing me. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, her hazel eyes steady. You've got that bookish look. I laughed a little too loud. English major. Probably why I'm broken crashing at my uncle's place. Her smile was small but real, softening the lines around her eyes. Port Haven's not kind to dreamers, she said. But it's got its own kind of poetry. I wanted to ask what she meant, what her poetry was, but my phone buzzed. Jonas. Traffic's a mess. Be there in 20. Sit tight. I showed her the screen, rolling my eyes. Looks like I'm stuck here a bit. She didn't seem to mind. Coffee? She asked, already reaching for the pot. Or you still sticking to water? Coffee's good, I said, and she poured 2 mugs, sliding one across the counter. Her fingers brushed the handle as I took it, and I felt that same jolt from last time, like a wire sparking under my skin. I told myself it was nothing, just the heat, the small space, the way her eyes kept finding mine like they were searching for something. We sat at her kitchen table, a small wooden thing that wobbled slightly under the weight of our mugs. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged, like the air before a storm. She traced the rim of her mug with her finger, her nails catching the light. "So," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet, "what's a guy like you doing back in Port Haven, besides sorting through old houses?" I shrugged, staring into my coffee, the steam curling like a question mark. "My uncle died last year. Left me the house. Figured I'd come clean it out, maybe sell it. I don't know. I'm still figuring things out." She nodded, her expression softening, like she saw the cracks I was trying to hide. "That's heavy for 23, she said, and I looked up, startled she'd nailed my age. "How'd you know?" I asked, my voice quieter than I meant. "You've got that look," she said, her tone gentle but piercing, "like you're carrying something too big and don't know where to set it down." Her words hit harder than they should have, like she'd seen straight through me. I took a sip of coffee, scalding my tongue, and tried to shift the focus. "What about you? What's your story living here alone?" Her smile faded just for a moment, and I regretted asking. "Not much to tell," she said, her voice careful. "Moved here a few years ago after things fell apart. Needed a fresh start." She didn't elaborate, and I didn't push, but the photo on the shelf, the man's arm around her, filled in the blanks she left. We talked for a while, about nothing and everything. The town's obsession with crab festivals, the diner's awful fries, the way the gulls screamed at dawn like they owned the place. She was easy to talk to, her voice pulling me in, but there was a line she didn't cross, a wall she kept up. Every time I nudged too close to something personal, she'd steer us back to safe ground, her words light but firm. And yet, she didn't ask me to leave. She didn't check her phone or glance at the clock. She just sat there, her fingers wrapped around her mug, her eyes catching mine in a way that made my chest ache. When my phone buzzed again, Jonas pulling into the lot, I felt a twist in my gut, like I wasn't ready to go. I stood, setting the mug on the counter. "Guess that's my ride," I said, trying to sound normal. She stood too, walking me to the door, her steps slow, deliberate. "Thanks for the company, Nate," she said, and there was that look again, the one that saw too much, felt too much. "Don't be a stranger." I nodded, my throat tight. "I won't." As I followed Jonas to the other apartment, my mind was still in hers, replaying the way her fingers had brushed the mug, the way her voice had softened when she said my name. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it was something. What he'll say next will change everything, for her and for him. The week after that coffee with Lila Warwick felt like walking on a tightrope, each step wobbling between normalcy and something I couldn't name. Port Haven's salty air clung to me as I moved through my days, sorting through my uncle's cluttered house on Sable Street, the floorboards creaking under my sneakers like they were warning me to stay grounded. I was 23, adrift with a useless degree and no plan, but my mind kept circling back to her apartment, to the way her hazel eyes had caught mine, sharp and heavy, like they were pulling something out of me I didn't know was there. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting moment, a trick of the light, but I'd catch myself staring down Anchorway, wondering if I'd see her crossing the parking lot, her dark hair catching the breeze. It was Thursday, late afternoon, the sky over the harbor turning a bruised purple, when Jonas called. I was in the garage, knee-deep in boxes of rusted fishing lures and old magazines, the air thick with dust and the faint tang of motor oil. My phone buzzed on a workbench, and Jonas's voice crackled through. "Nate, you up for another gig? Bayside Lofts, kitchen outlet acting up? Quick fix, same pay?" My heart kicked against my ribs, and I hated how much I hoped it was her apartment. I told myself it was just a job, just $50, but my hands were already grabbing my jacket. "Yeah, I'm in," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. By the time I reached Bayside Lofts, the air had cooled, carrying the hum of the diner's neon sign across the street. Jonas was already there, his van parked crookedly in the lot, toolbox open by his feet. He looked beat, his eyes shadowed from a long day. "Ms. Warwick's place again," he said, jerking his thumb toward the building. "Outlets sparking. Let's make this quick." My stomach twisted, a mix of nerves and something sharper, and I followed him up the creaking staircase, my sneakers scuffing the worn steps. Lila opened the door before Jonas could knock, like she'd been waiting. She stood there, framed by the doorway, in a black sweater and jeans, her dark hair pulled back, a few strands loose against her neck. She looked tired, her face carrying a quiet weight, like she hadn't slept well. I guessed she was closer to 45, her beauty sharpened by the lines around her eyes, the kind that come from years of carrying something heavy. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant, with that same rasp that made every word feel like it was meant just for me. "The outlet sparked last night. Scared the hell out of me." Jonas brushed past her, already in work mode. "We'll handle it, Ms. Warwick. Shouldn't take long." I followed, my hands stuffed in my pockets, trying to act like this was just another job. But the air in her apartment felt different tonight. Thicker, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. The lavender scent was fainter, overtaken by a sharp, acrid whiff of burnt plastic from the faulty outlet. The living room was the same, tidy with the bookshelf and its photos, the single coffee mug on the counter, but it felt smaller, like the walls were pressing in. The kitchen was a tight squeeze, barely enough room for Jonas to kneel by the counter, prying off the outlet cover with a screwdriver. I stood close, passing tools, my shoulder brushing the edge of the counter. Lila hovered by the sink, arms crossed, watching us work. Her presence was like a pulse in the room, steady but undeniable. Every time I glanced up, her eyes were on me, then flicked away, quick and careful, like she was afraid of what I'd see. I wondered if she felt it too, this thing between us that wasn't supposed to exist, this pull that made my chest ache. Jonas muttered under his breath, wrestling with a stubborn screw. "Nate, hold this wire," he said, thrusting a pair of pliers at me. I crouched beside him, my fingers closing around the wire, its insulation rough against my skin. Lila stepped closer, leaning over to see what we were doing, and her arm grazed mine. Just a fleeting touch, barely there, but it sent a jolt through me, sharp and hot, like I'd brushed a live circuit. I looked at her, and for a split second, our eyes locked, hers wide, like she'd felt it too. She stepped back quickly, turning to the sink, her hands gripping the edge like she needed to steady herself. "Need anything?" she asked, her voice too even, like she was trying to smooth over the moment. "We're good," Jonas said, not looking up, his focus on the outlet. But I couldn't stop watching her, the way her shoulders tensed, the way her fingers dug into the counter. I wanted to say something, to break the silence that felt heavier than the wires in my hand, but my throat was tight. My words stuck. The job dragged on, the wiring older and messier than Jonas expected. He had to replace the whole outlet, cursing softly as he worked. I stayed crouched, passing screws, holding wires, trying to focus on the task and not on Lila's quiet movements, rinsing a glass, wiping the counter, her steps soft but deliberate. She made coffee, like last time, setting 2 mugs on the counter without a word. When she handed me mine, her fingers lingered near the handle, not touching but close enough that I could feel the warmth of her skin. My pulse hammered and I muttered a thanks, my voice rougher than I meant. Jonas finished up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "All set, Ms. Warwick," he said, packing his tools. "No more sparks. Call if it acts up again." He was already moving toward the door, eager to get home. I followed, but my steps were slow, my eyes on Lila. She was by the window now, looking out at the darkened street, her reflection faint in the glass. The slump in her shoulders was more pronounced, like she was carrying something she couldn't put down. "Thanks, Nate," she said, turning to me, her voice so soft it barely carried. It hit me harder than it should have, that quiet gratitude, like she was thanking me for more than the outlet, I nodded, unable to find words, and followed Jonas out. But I didn't leave. Not really. In the parking lot, Jonas tossed me the 50 and climbed into his van, muttering about dinner plans. I lingered, my hands in my pockets, the gravel crunching under my feet. I told myself I was just catching my breath, but the truth was I didn't want to go back to Sable Street, to the empty house and the ghosts of my uncle's life. I wanted to go back upstairs, to knock on her door to see what would happen if I did. It was a reckless thought, one I knew I should bury, but it wouldn't let go. I was still standing there, the streetlight casting long shadows, when the building's door opened. Lila stepped out, her jacket pulled tight against the evening chill, her hair loose now, catching the light. She stopped when she saw me, her expression unreadable, like she was as surprised as I was. "You're still here," she said, not a question, her voice carrying that same weight. "Yeah," I said, my throat dry. "Just thinking." She nodded, like she understood, and took a step closer. The streetlight hit her face, highlighting the lines around her eyes, the quiet pain she carried. "You okay?" she asked. And it wasn't just polite. It was real, like she saw the same ache in me that I saw in her. "I don't know," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. It was the truth. I didn't know why I was still there, why I couldn't walk away, why her voice felt like it was unraveling me. "Are you?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought she'd turn and go back inside, leaving me with nothing but the sound of the gulls. But she took another step, close enough that I could smell the lavender on her, faint but unmistakable. "I haven't been okay in years," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, raw and unguarded. "But right now, I don't know either." The air between us crackled, heavy with everything we weren't saying. I wanted to reach for her, to close the distance, but my hands stayed in my pockets, clenched into fists. She was too old for me, too broken, too everything I wasn't supposed to want. And yet I did, wanted her in a way that scared me, not because it was wrong, but because it felt too true, too real for a guy like me, still figuring out who I was. "Is that wrong?" I asked, my voice cracking, the words slipping out like they'd been waiting all day. I felt exposed, like I'd handed her something fragile, something I couldn't take back. She didn't speak. She just nodded, her eyes locked on mine, and in that nod, I saw it all. Her loneliness, her pain, the same reckless pull I felt tearing at me. Her breath hitched, and she took a step back, her hands trembling slightly. "I should go," she said, but her voice was soft, like she didn't mean it. "You should," I said, but my feet didn't move, rooted to the gravel. She reached out, her hand hovering near mine, close enough to make my skin ache, then pulled back, turning toward the door.